Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Emma Koval. I am president of 4S and I'm professor of anthropology at Deakin University in Melbourne in Australia. And I'm joined
This is good. There's going to be a lot of ghosts.
So I think we just need to turn the mute that computer. Yeah. 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 Okay, Leandro, let's give it a go.
Gracias. Yo was saying that the Latour jokes. Latourian joke. We hope that the echo ends soon. Very happy to have you all here. Okay. In this second opportunity, I would like to thank you again.
That's
Wait, 1 minute.
No, I think it's okay. Otherwise, you would be hearing yourself.
So we have this fantastic panel to celebrate alive and celebrate the work of Latour. So we will begin works by Emma. Then we will introduce panel, and probably after that we will thoughts and comments. Emma?
Thank you. Like all STS scholars, I would venture to say, I've been profoundly influenced by Latour, knowingly and unknowingly. He's part of the fabric of STS thought. His fierce and relentless recognition of the agency of all things and the multiplicity of worlds, and his vision of a political ecology, a parliament of things, has shaped thousands of scholars over many decades. I think many of my generation, coming through Anglophone universities in the 1990s, read the English translation of We Have Never Been Modern and felt the scales falling from our eyes. The very workings of modernity, that machine for producing divisions between nature and culture, had been revealed, and once revealed, I never saw the world in the same way again. There have been some wonderful pieces written about Latour since his death 2 months ago, some by people on this panel. In a piece by my compatriot Stephen Mierke for Aeon magazine, he recounts the story told in The Pasteurization of France of Latour's epiphany at the age of 25, when he worked as a high school teacher in Burgundy. In a moment of secular revelation while driving, he formulated a kind of mantra that guided his work from that day onwards. And this is a quote: "Nothing can be reduced to anything else. Nothing can be deduced from anything else. Everything may be allied to everything else." Although some see ecopolitics as a through line in his life's work, this came to the fore in his later writing, with, I think, Has Critique Run Out of Steam in 2004 as a potential hinge point. He saw both the radical independence and interdependence of all things. His theoretical prowess was dazzling, but the true brilliance of his scholarship was quite simple. His unique and powerful interpretation of the world and his ability to communicate it to his readers one step at a time. In this session, we'll hear from 6 scholars who have engaged deeply with different aspects of Latour's oeuvre. I will introduce all of them now, and then they'll speak for 10 minutes each. At the end, we'll have some time for comments, short, brief things to share from our in-person audience or from the Q&A function for those listening on Teams. But it's not a Q&A because we're not experts, we're just sharing our thoughts. So to our speakers. So first to mention that Gabrielle Het unfortunately could not make it to Cholula, so she won't be speaking. So first we will have Chris Kelty. Appointments in the Institute for Society and Genetics, the Department of Information Studies and the Department of Anthropology. His research interests centre on social theory and technology, the cultural significance of information technology, the relationship of participation technology and the public sphere, and other things as well. And people are sitting conveniently in order, so you can tell who they are. Dominique Vink is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Lausanne. His research focuses on the sociology of science and innovation, mainly in the field of engineering of digital cultures and humanities. He's chief editor of the Revue d'Anthropologie des Connaissances. Annalisa Paliza is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Bologna and visiting professor at the University of Twente, and Vice President of STS Italia. Her interests include the socio-technical aspects of data infrastructures, including ontologies and interoperability, ethnographic, digital and mixed methods, governance of and by technology, data infrastructures, populations, institutions, and network cultures. Wenling Tu is Distinguished Professor of the Department of Public Administration, Dean of the International College of Innovation and Director of the Centre for Innovative Democracy at National Chiang Chai University in Taiwan. Her major areas of research include environmental planning and policy and sustainability, public participation and deliberative democracy, risk communication, and environmental activism. Lea Velo is Professor of Social Studies of Science and Technology in the Department of Science and Technology Policy at the State University of Campinas. Her work has examined the dynamics of production and use of knowledge, international cooperation in science and technology, evaluation of science and technology policies and activities, training of human resources for research, and science and technology indicators. And last will be Sergio Sismondo, who is Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University, Canada, and until recently was the editor of the journal Social Studies of Science. He identifies as a generalist in STS with empirical interests in the tactics and practices that drug companies use to influence medicine and in frameworks for understanding political economies of pharmaceutical knowledge. And just before we start with the talks, I will share a short message from Ivan de Costa Marques, founder and president of the Brazilian Society for Social Studies of Sciences and Technologies, who was invited to be on this panel but was unable to travel. Very short. Bruno Latour, so this is me being Ivan. Bruno Latour is an invaluable ally for all those engaged in decolonising modern sciences and technologies. It is as if Bruno Latour were born in a new kitchen where there were only new ingredients, gears, and conditions to prepare the dishes for the demanding diners who think about sciences and technologies. Having always been in this new kitchen as one of its main architects and endowed with exceptional communicative ability, Latour had almost no option but to actively militate in support of the new cuisine. Science studies is the new kitchen. In fact, it has no predetermined architecture, but the laboratory studies of the 1970s and 80s configured its first ingredients, seasonings, and equipment. Since then, Chef Latour elaborated a new and diverse menu of appetizers for decolonising the sciences and technologies. these are quotes, the scientific article, hierarchies, authorities, and scales in technoscience, nature, society, a seamless fabric, the so-called diffusion model, and where to land, and many others, which once resituated in the colonized world, may bring alternatives to the fast food poisoning of the imperial colonizing technosciences to the table. So with that, I will hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Emma. I never win anything in raffles or lotteries or anything, so particularly honored to have been chosen out of the hat for this event. And there's probably plenty of other people who have a closer relationship with Latour than I had, and maybe know more about him than I do. So really, I only have a simple story to tell about my interaction with him, about a story from a time when I got to know him over a week. I'm also having this hallucination right now where literally everyone in the audience looks like Latour. So I'm going to try and do my best, I promise. In February of 2007, Bruno visited Rice University at the invitation of the Humanities Research Center. I was the emissary, chauffeur, and impresario of this visit, alongside my duties of organizing talks on the work of John Dewey and Walter Lippmann, seminars, nation versions of the Modes of Existence book, dinners with the French department, which Bruno subsequently begged me never to do again, and lunches with all manner of somewhat nonplussed faculty and students. I got to know Latour as a human. American cities being what they are, I was mostly responsible for driving him around Houston from dinner to event to lunch to his apartment. At 6'4", he could barely wedge himself into my VW Golf, and would therefore occasionally, while for instance vigorously declaiming the fascism of Alain Badiou, which was one of the few disparagements he made, I would say, accidentally knock the stick shift out of gear, sending the car into free fall on the already terrifying Houston freeways. Yeah. Overall, we spent a fair amount of time in the car together talking, and I was, of course, thrilled to have this unusual captive audience of someone whose work was foundational to my own training and interests in science studies, and of increasing interest to people outside of what was, when I entered in the 1990s, still a relatively small field. I like to think, in fact, that Latour enabled me to embrace my own sense of the absurd, the joyous, the bizarre, even the goofy as an academic. And I was eager to share with him the weird and wonderful world in which I then lived, a world populated with alligators and bayous, geochemists and architects, cancer centers and oil finance, Enron and Patron, Tejanos and rodeos. During this visit, I also helped broker a dinner with Rice University nanotechnologist named James Tour. Great name, said James Tour when he was asked about a meeting with Latour. James Tour didn't know who Latour was, but I think something must have clued him into Latour's stature. Distance breeds enchantment, as STS scholars like to say. The arrangements moved from a reluctant agreement to meet Latour for coffee to Tour offering to have Latour and some guests to his house for dinner, the dinner of Tour and Latour. Tour's enchantment was, for me, an opportunity to align some interests. I was doing research on nanotechnology at the time, and while Tour was mere steps away from my building, this lack of distance meant that I couldn't get him to even respond to an email or a phone call. So when Tour offered this hospitality, and even before asking Bruno, I agreed. It would be an excellent idea, and so the dinner was set. The secret to Tour's interest was that Latour was not only a student of science, but first a theology student, and remained a member of the Roman Catholic Church throughout his life. James Tour, as it turned out, was not only a nanotechnologist, but was what is known as a Messianic Jew. Born to Judaism in New York, he adopted the belief early in his life that Jesus was in fact the promised Messiah of the Judaic prophecies. Messianic Jews don't renounce Judaism, but they accept Christ, so there's no conversion per se. Tour was and remains one of the most fervent and outspoken lovers of Jesus you can imagine in an American university, but in a way that's much different from the evangelical Christians that have engulfed American life and are common throughout Texas. Tour remains to this day a kind of part-time preacher and probably a thorn in the side of the Rice University administration on a daily basis. In 2007, he was flush with nanotechnological success and very eager to discuss Jesus with Bruno Latour. My good friend, the historian of science, Carl Pearson, and I accompanied Latour to Tour's house. We came bearing the gift of several bottles of Latour wine, which was received awkwardly because, as it turned out, among Tour's beliefs about virtue was the promise he had made to Jesus never to allow alcohol to cross the threshold of his home. Never one to stand on ceremony, Jesus made an exception for Latour that night, and for Carl and I too. And a corkscrew was painstakingly located from a dusty bowl on a distant mantelpiece so the esteemed visitors could partake. And while the host politely poured himself a glass of the finest blood of Christ, he did not thereafter touch it. Before Jesus, though, we hustled into the living room where a projector and a screen had been erected. The projector sat on a coffee table atop a book that was called something like Jerusalem, Eternal Capital of Israel. This was the height, you'll have to remember, of discourse about the clash of civilizations and years of anti-Islamic rhetoric, the war in Iraq, etc. It was particularly deeply felt at that moment in Texas. Carl understood this better than I did. But I approached the whole thing, and I think Latour approached it too, with a certain enthusiasm for simply being allowed to see it up close, and a certain willingness to grant it a hearing, which, although ecumenical, is somewhat risky. So Tour proceeded to give a small lecture about his work on nanotechnology. He had, in 2005, through ingenious synthetic and technical means, managed to create tiny nano cars, 4 carbon molecules arranged in a square that quote unquote drove along a graphene surface. For this, he had become an international celebrity. As he talked without break about the magic and wonder of nanotechnology, the immense possibilities for the petrochemical industry, and the harmony and beauty of nature that his work represented, I began to worry that I had made a horrible mistake in arranging this dinner. I briefly had an out-of-body experience in which I observed the room and Latour in it seated next to me as if on a film or in a TV series like a sitcom, where I was the callow, parochial, sycophantic assistant professor trying to please the grand Parisian philosopher, only to have dragged him into a suburban Houston tract home for the equivalent of a science and religion Tupperware party. But that was not what it was like. Latour was utterly at home with Tour and his science. Indeed, he was already familiar with it. The seriousness with which he engaged Tour in his presentation made the whole thing far more interesting for everyone involved. Latour took Tour seriously from the get-go, even if Tour did not know who Latour was. Of all the time I spent that week with Latour, this was the most amazing and meaningful and exemplary hour. Latour modeled for me, at least, and I think for all the guests, what it looked like to simply take someone else absolutely and completely seriously. In that language of the pasteurization of France that Emma referred to, Latour was in this moment absolutely opposed to reducing anyone or anything to anything else. Latour was not a scientist or a religious scientist. He was not a millenarian Jew or a Zionist. He was not a crackpot or a genius. He just was an interesting person worthy of being understood, worthy of undivided attention, curiosity, and respect. I don't know if Latour had prepared ahead of time or if he had already considered the forms of manipulation of matter that Tour engaged in the relationship to oil and fossil fuels for the challenges of representing single atoms, or if he simply had and we know this, had a gift for asking good questions, like any good priest or psychoanalyst. The result was the same, which was that Tour and Latour were equals in conversation. Tour did not patronize Latour, nor vice versa. And over many years of teaching Latour's work, I often explain to students that it helps to read Latour not as a theorist, but as a methodologist, and also maybe as a theologian. Even after this event, I would use this example because it's hard to explain exactly what Latour was doing in that moment, but he was doing it very, very well. When I first met Latour for this trip to Houston, I was an assistant professor at Rice University. I'll skip over a little bit here because I don't need to go through the fact that he was invited and Rice was going to pay him a great deal of money, and he said that's more than I make in a year, and he wasn't being kind. He was kind of disgusted with it, and then he said I'll come, but only if I can donate this money to my university for the students. And so I was sort of impressed by this, but I also learned fairly quickly why he was able to make a magnanimous gesture like this. I'm an accomplished drinker, but I didn't know at the time that he was Latour of the Maison Louis Latour. Though in fairness, there's at least 2 Latour winemakers. The other one, Chateau Latour, is famous Bordeaux estate, whereas Bruno, as he explained to me, is a provincial Bourgogne enterprise, which is a difference that only real Francophiles can appreciate. Anyways, in preparation for this dinner at Tour's house, we went to the liquor store. And if you've been to Texas, you'll know Specs, the liquor store, a warehouse-sized building filled with wine from every conceivable region, country, method, and miscalculation. Aisles upon aisles represent the universal and the eminently local way that Texans love, bigger than big. Latour wandered the store with Hannah, my wife, and I, and he was extremely tickled to discover a robust representation of his family's wine. In fact, beyond tickled, he was surprised to find vintages that were actually kind of hard to find in France. He selected a half dozen bottles, and we meandered back through the rows of Hungarian wines and Greek wines, Argentinian and South African wines, towering shelves of idiosyncratic mezcals, and ridiculously long aisles of mixers and bitters and juices and sodas. Once we paid for it and were in the parking lot under a pink-purple Houston sunset, he said to the two of us something which to this day constitutes the punchline of a story we've both told many times and in many ways. He said, I think I finally understand what people mean by relativism. And then just the last part, so that to come back to the dinner with Tour. So at that dinner, the topic shifted to religion, from science to religion, of course, and that anxiety that we felt, in dragging Latour into this situation didn't really dissipate here. We were in part sort of puzzled by things going on in the household, and there were many signs of kind of cultural signs that I think maybe we weren't completely attuned to. But against this backdrop, a high-minded discussion of religion commenced at the table. For most of us, the terms of debate and discussion felt well beyond our ken. As Carl put it, we all felt outwitted at both ends and became spectators to a debate. That debate was an interesting example of how Latour thought about religion. I can't remember much of the discussion because for me, basically anything involving scripture feels like reading life insurance writers, the mix of acts of God and long meandering qualifying sentences. But I'm blessed because Carl wrote the following beautiful account of the discussion as he remembered it. He said, the most important memory is the following. The conversation moved to the relationship between science and religion. Hand gestures became important. Tour was referring to his knowledge of nanoparticles by gesturing to himself, and his knowledge or understanding was fully Cartesian, something he possessed as an individual. Religion for Tour at that time in that context was social or collective or politicized. Tour moved his hands in such a way as to embrace his co-religionists. Latour, in what in retrospect was a stunning use of Protestant values in a Catholic-Jewish debate, said, and I'm very nearly quoting, science is there, gesturing up and away from his body. Religion is here. It was a defining moment. Tour was taken aback by the suggestion that his religion was not deeply felt and personal, which of course it was, but that was the rhetorical force of Latour's words against that position that Latour had staked out. Tour said nothing for a few moments. Latour was of course gracious and gentle, but the point had been made that Tour, the master manipulator of matter, the engineer of the tiny, had not really thought very deeply about the human world. The discussion picked up again. I don't remember in what direction.
Podemos pasar al siguiente. Bueno, voy a hacer mi presentación en castellano, pero el texto es en inglés en la pantalla. Es probable que vamos a repetir varias cosas porque ya escuchamos dos veces un tema clave, pero voy a también insistir en ese mismo tema. Quisiera presentar este corto homenaje a Bruno Latour poniendo en evidencia su principal legado para mí. Los homenajes rendidos a Bruno Latour durante esos 2 últimos meses reflejan la importancia de los temas que trato. La ciencia, la tecnología, la innovación, el derecho, la religión, la ficción, la política y el futuro de la planeta. Su reputación se ha extendido mucho más allá del mundo académico y científico, como eso lo demuestra el amplio abanico de testimonio que se han llegado esos meses. Como reflejo de esta diversidad, sus obras se encuentran en estanterías muy dispersas en las librerías, en sociología, por supuesto, en filosofía, en historia, en ciencias políticas, pero también en turismo, con su libro París Invisible. Y sus obras han sido también descubiertas por distintas generaciones. La interpretación de su legado parece fragmentada. Se ha convertido en un autor importante para todos, pero por razones distintas, diferentes. Sin embargo, le interesaba sobre todo una cosa, que es la verdad, cómo se establece. Nunca dejó de buscar los modos de establecer la verdad. Ya siguiente. Cuando era profesor de filosofía, se cansó del reduccionismo que encontró en todos los campos. Matemáticos que buscan el fundamento último o unos axiomas de los que se pueda deducir todo el edificio matemático, filósofos que intentan pensar el ser como ser o buscan los fundamentos de todo, creyentes que imaginan un Dios del que todo viene, y científicos en busca de las leyes de la naturaleza o del origen del universo del que todo procedería. La pluralidad del mundo se redujo en un supuesto fundamento radical, una raíz única que debe ser revelada y de la que procede todos los demás. De lo que más tarde llamó una sobredosis de reduccionismo, extrajo unos 10 años después un principio de reducción que ya lo citamos 2 veces, pero va a ser la tercera. Nada puede reducirse a nada, nada puede deducirse de nada. Me parece un punto realmente clave. Él sugería que lo real es lo que resiste en las pruebas y las pruebas son de muchas formas muy variadas. 50 años después, describe una diversidad de modos de veredicción y de existencia, con la preocupación de encontrar un medio operativo para mantener esos modos de existencia, mantenerlos juntos para evitar que uno reduzca a los otros a la nada o que uno domine a los demás. Ya, siguiente. Gracias. En su época de estudiante, Bruno Latour descubrió la crítica de las formas textuales y la identificación de los añadidos realizados a las palabras originales para eliminarlas y acceder a la verdad. Sin embargo, en lugar de desnudar los textos para encontrar sus fundamentos, Bruno Latour descubrió la importancia de todas esas palabras añadidas, las traducciones y las reformulaciones. De hecho, las invenciones y mediaciones cuyo movimiento renueve el mensaje. Él escribió en 2012, cuando más se interpreta un conjunto de texto, se transforma, se retoma, se reproduce y se recrea cada vez de manera diferente, más probable es que se manifieste la verdad que hay en él. Esta afirmación se aplica también a su propia producción intelectual. Para entender su pensamiento, debemos seguir sus movimientos. Y para concluir, quisiera compartir unas palabras que hemos que pusimos en el comité de redacción de la revista de Antropología del Conocimiento. Su conocimiento alegre, su amor por la ciencia, su forma bondadosa de debatir nos han inspirado mucho y seguirán dejando una huella duradera en los trabajos que se ocupan de la producción de conocimiento y sus desplazamientos. Gracias.
Thanks, Emma, for including me in this panel. So preparing for today's meeting in Memoriam, I have experienced the same dilemma of choosing that I have when I teach to my students, of choosing what aspects of Bruno Latour's work to address. Eventually, I come to the decision that I will focus on only two connections. He would have called them associations. The first association comes from my personal experience, and it is with semiotics. And the second is related, as it is an association with what I see or largely relevant for this community, the association with material semiotics, and notably with Donna Haraway. So I hope Haraway and other colleagues can forgive me the many blind spots due to generational reasons. I'm afraid no reading can replace live discussions and participation to forest meetings. So I will conclude then with a quotation from Latour's inquiry into modes of existence as a way to recall his overarching aim to close the parentheses of modernity. So let's start with the first association, with semiotics. I have met Bruno Latour when I was a PhD student at the University of Milan, torn between a powerful male supervisor in sociology and my background training in semiotics at the School of Umberto Eco. A classic earthenware pot among metal pots, you could say. In my distressed search for a way out, I started reading a book oriented to sociologists. Well, at least that was claimed the title. Who moved familiar arguments, such as that the text is the social scientist lab. With this expression, in reassembling the social, Bruno Latour meant two things in my early understanding. First, that testing the consistency of a text, even without empirical experiments, is a way for sociologists to assess the truth value of their research. This statement was crucial for me at that time, as I was not only a PhD student torn between sociology and semiotics, but also a full-time worker at day and a PhD student at night, who didn't have daytime resources to conduct experiments. So knowing that I could focus on tests was a relief. Probably what convinced me that I could bring my PhD to a successful end. Yet, and this is the second meaning, texts were not only those that I learned to analyze as part of my semiotic training. Texts were something broader. Texts were the outcomes of the enunciation. But what if enunciation was to be understood in its broad meaning of acts, practices that brought something into existence? Then everything could have been regarded as text. So the empowering consequence for me as a torn PhD student was that I started thinking at any act of coming into being as enunciation. Practices, artifacts, interfaces, databases, they suddenly appeared to me as text I could have linked together in flat, multiple networks. So thanks Latour for liberating that PhD student from the Chilean terribleness of semioticians and sociologists. But in more prosaic words, I had just discovered the semiotic roots of Bruno Latour's metaphysics. What he, together with Madalena Krisch, Michel Calon, John Lowe, Antoine Agnon, called translation or delegation or shifting was in fact the theory of enunciation called débrayage. Years later, Maria Giulia Dondero would have summarized my probably naive early discovery with a sharp expression: a movement from uttered enunciation to practical enunciation. In 2017, the semiotician Jacques Fontanille wrote that Latour's main intellectual project was to comprehend the being. If this is true, it would qualify Latour as philosopher, despite his skepticism towards the figure. And yet Fontanille added that Latour's project to comprehend the being was not about the being as being, but about the being as the other. And this would qualify Latour as an anthropologist. Yet Fontanille continues, and I quote, "To consider being as another, one must not remain in the being, but pass in the other. Ascent, a pass are required, and that is where enunciation takes place," end of quote. This is exactly what Latour meant with chain of translation. the pass, the translation, the delegation, the displacement. And Fontanier continues, and I quote again, but the enunciation doesn't know the generic singular. It is declined only in the specific singular, on a case-by-case basis, or in general in the plural. There are therefore as many existences as there are possible sendings, effective enunciations, end of quote. So it's difficult here not associating this citation to the STS toolkit made of situatedness and multiplicity. But for Latour, even before engaging with SSK and ANT, situatedness and multiplicity came from the semiotic theory of enunciation. So it was probably this genealogy that in reassembling the social brought him to state that, and I quote, semiotics doesn't survive sea travels. Attention to text qua text remains a continental obsession. And this citation brings me to the second association, which I wish to address. An association that for years have literally taken place across the sea, the one with Donna Haraway. Because Latour was imprecise, or more likely provocative, who knows, in saying that semiotic doesn't survive sea travels. Indeed, the framing of material semiotics was introduced by Donna Haraway and others in feminist STS. And in this framing, I see the overlap between enactment on one hand and enunciation on the other hand, which constitutes the link across the sea, so to say. Haraway recurred to semiotics in the same period as Akrish and Latour did. In 1992, she wrote an article titled The Promises of Monsters, in which she used the semiotic square as a sort of divertissement. In her own words, an artificial device that generates meaning very noisily. It was a serious joke, but it also showed the closeness of Haraway and Latour in taking the text seriously and addressing prejudices against text as mere fictions. In a 2000 interview with Nina Like in Horus, Haraway recalls that texts are never only text, but rhetorical and therefore political tools. And Latour himself has repeatedly made clear that texts should not be dismissed as constructions, fictions, but are heuristic materials. So despite their different genealogies, Latour's roots in the semiotic theory of enunciation and Haraway's framing of material semiotics constitute an important link in the STS community chain of thought. In that interview with Nina Like, Haraway will eventually acknowledge that Latour has taken on some insight from STS feminism. And these traces are indeed explicitly voiced in, for example, again, a reassembling the social, where Latour in the second move attributes to Haraway the most outspoken version of the multiple layering of enactment. In this acknowledgement, Haraway replaces Lore. But probably the most touching attempt by Latour to literally enact the dialogue with Haraway is a 2005 paper written for a book in homage of Donna Haraway, but then rejected by the editor. And I thank Assunta Viteriti for pointing this text to me. In that text, Latour literally enacts a dialogue between the two of them at the margin of a conference while they're rushing to catch a flight. The dialogue aims to figure out what divides them and what brings them closer. What divides them is the micro-macro distinction, and Haraway's need to see the big picture by adopting a critical approach, while Latour is depicted as a late Habermasian, and he depicting himself as a late Habermasian, to be clear, so very ironic. On the other side, what brings them close is the acknowledgement that science studies are in the middle of a difficult search for political relevance. So they diverge on the method, but agree on the goals of changing irreversible power relations. So eventually, this paper is in itself is a literary text, paying tribute not only to the Latour-Haraway association, but also to the humanistic dialogue tradition. It makes me think at the dialogue concerning the two chief war systems by Galileo, with its use of an oral style, its smoke of ancient Greek language, its use of digressions and repetitions, but above all, its use of irony as a rhetorical tool. The Galilean dialogue was a work of critique and Latour chooses the form of the dialogue to criticize Haraway's call for critique. So this is indeed a literary masterpiece in itself and a very ironic one. Not only, as Galileo's dialogue opened the modern era, Latour's long-term work aims to close the modern parenthesis. His Opus Magnum, Inquiry into Modes of Existence, is very clear about this. And let me quote his own words. Why not transform this whole business of recalling modernity into a grand question of design? Such castles in the air have to be judged by the only text worth its salt. Would the potential inhabitant feel more comfortable there? Is it more habitable? At bottom, this is what it is all about. Can one institute the moderns in habitats that are, if not stable, at least sustainable and reasonable? More simply, more radically, can one offer them a dwelling place at long last? After all these years of wandering in the desert, do they have hope of reaching not the promised land, but Earth itself? Quite simply, the only one they have, at once underfoot and all around them, the aptly named Gavia. End of quote. So I will use his own words to thank Bruno Latour, and I wish he has found his dwelling place to land on at long last.
His later work on Earth, critical zones, and climate change. Next slide. So in this tour, Latour used the concept of mutation to replace the concept of crisis to show the ecological change is constant. And we need to understand the relationship between science, technology, and politics with different ways of thinking. He thought neither nature nor the globe are at the right scale or the right composition to understand the interlocking heterogeneous complexity we face today. Instead, he refers to the notion of critical zone as a spot on the envelope of a biosphere or a zone as a unit beyond traditional geographic countries. Critical is as a concept of science, but also can explain a distribution of science and politics. Its intermediary zone between different parts and it's composed of a lot of disciplines in all sorts of scales in order to understand how it functions. Next. So some remarks I want to share is from my Taiwanese STS scholars, Professor Chen Zhongwen. They argue that Latour's research is counter-traditional in French sociology. His research broadly covered the topic from laboratory, climate, anthropocene, Gaia, which is not directly related to the core discussion in traditional sociology that may focus on human society. He gave the voices to non-human actors and reshaped the discourses and the power relations in the politics. He tried different ways to influence the audience through curation that reach out more public to reflect on the pressing problems we face today. In his view, in Professor Chen's view, Taiwanese community is more influenced by Latour's earlier laboratory and ANT work, and his later work, Climate Urgency, Politics of Nature, and how he devoted to curation as a way to visualize and exhibit his claims, as well as make things public, is still unfamiliar to most Taiwanese scholars. Professor Lin Wenyuan also took the notion of kayaking to address how Latour's ANT is mentoring for Taiwan and vice versa. He provided example how ANT is followed, displaced, and reworked by Taiwanese STS scholars and ANT as an approach to entangle with Taiwanese STS research. Next. So Latour was invited as a curator for Taipei 2020 biennial in Taipei Fine Art Museum. The theme was "You and I Don't Live on the Same Planet, New Diplomatic Encounters." Following Latour's influential publications such as the Publics of Nature, Facing Gaia in 2017, and Down to Earth 2018, and the theme of the previous biennial Post-Nature, the 2020 biennial had been dedicated to dramatic ecological crisis the world is facing. And Taiwan is, in his view, with so much inspiration from its diversity, complexity, and the front line of geopolitics conflict in terms of social and earth geological perspectives. And next. So here is a poster for the 2020 biennial, and you can see that there are 5 planets in the exhibition: planet escape, planet security, planet globalization, planet terminal, and critical zone. Okay, the next. And what Taiwan STS community got involved is the part of public project, which aims to increase the interaction between art and audience. The original idea of the project is from Make It Work in Paris in 2015 that gathered 200 students from all over the world in a simulation of the International Climate Conference, COP21, held in Paris. Based on the real subject of debate and the actual modality of the negotiations, the students experimented and reformulated the debates that made it possible to envision breaking the existing impasses. Next. So the photo was taken in 2019, that you can see a lot of us sitting here and my colleagues in Taiwan. For the preparation for the 2020 Taipei Biennial, Latour and Taiwanese STS scholars met together in Taipei Fine Art Museum. Latour expressed his idea about localizing theater of negotiation in Taiwan with suitable topics that would work. After his visit, we in Taiwan decided to collaborate with curators and took advantage of the classes in 5 universities. Work with students to experiment role planning in addressing several social, technical, ecological controversies that exist in Taiwan. In the process, the students discussed the contemporary issues with invited real stakeholders and the audience. By aiding the non-human actors in the negotiation table, the debates were reshaped and brought reflection to the audience. Okay, so next, okay. So now here are 4 projects of the Theater of Negotiation, presenting renewable energy, food safety, assisted reproduction, and nuclear waste siting controversies. And the next one, and I would like to show like 2 short video clips as a demo how the Theater of Negotiation work localized in Taiwan. But probably because of time, maybe we can just show that one because it's only like 2 minutes. So, Eva, can you click? Yeah. Oh, whatever. Do you think it worked? Okay, so if it's not work, you know that everybody can, use the QR code to view the video. The QR code. Okay. So okay, yeah, there's a because the STS community that make the documentary for about half an hour, but here I only show like the 2 or 3 minutes, and the other is from my the Center for Innovative Democracy that we are doing the nuclear waste siting issues, and also present in the Taipei Fine Art Museum as one part of the Theater of Negotiation. Okay, so the next slide. So in the end, I want to borrow a few words from my colleague Paul Jobin at Academic Sinica about Latour. He frames Bruno's impact on Taiwanese STS scholar into 2 big areas of topic. The first one is the Bruno of laboratory life and ANT, or Latour 1.0. And the other one, from We Have Never Been and Politics of Nature to his more recent work on Gaia as Latour 2.0, but this will need to be tested and refined. And finally, we thank to Latour for his continuing inspiration to Taiwan STS community, and we were very honored to work with him in his very final large exhibition, art exhibition project in Taiwan. And I think we owe him a lot of, yeah, thank you.
When I was invited to contribute to this session honoring Bruno Latour, my first thought was, what could I say about Latour's work and legacy? After all that has already been said, not only by academic colleagues here and elsewhere, but also the international press, social media, blogs all over the world. Then it caught my attention in the email from Emma that I could talk about my memories of him. So this is what I will do here. It was not a very long memory. I just met him once. And if you bear with me, I have to give you a context so you understand why this was so important to me. I must start by saying that I was not influenced by Latour when I was becoming a researcher in social studies of science. People of my generation doing PhD in the beginning of the 80s. I started mine in 1980. I was in the middle of my PhD at the Science Policy Research Unit at the Sussex University in the UK when his and Woger's laboratory life appeared. And although I found the account stimulating and at times fascinating, it described scientific practices that were very, very far from what my agricultural researchers were doing in Brazil, who were my subject. And I finished the dissertation and moved back to Brazil. I worked for the National Research Council, which was like the National Science Foundation and the other foundations for science. And I was there a program officer for agricultural sciences and the environment. And in this capacity, I was part of a committee that evaluated proposals of foreign scientific expeditions and international research collaboration projects in Brazilian Amazonia. At that time, during the second half of the 1980s, there was considerable controversy in the country about foreign research institutions setting up research facilities in Amazonia. The French Orstone, the German Max Planck Institute, the American Smithsonian. This feeling was exacerbated by the approval of an initiative of the British Royal Society, of the British Royal Geographic Society, which was allegedly invited by the Brazilian Environmental Secretary at the time to make an ecological survey of the Maracá Island in the northern part of Brazilian Amazonia. And they were offered the infrastructure available in the site to host the British scientists. For the sake of context, it is important to remember that in 1985, Brazil was still under a military dictatorship. This invitation launched a project and motivated the British to search for sponsors to find the project and scientists in Britain to carry it out. Over 90 British researchers were involved and in the island of Maracá for 18 months doing research. It was because of the Maracá Rainforest Project that in 1989, I went back to the UK, this time to the University of Edinburgh, to collect information, interview participant researchers of the Maracá project, to visit laboratories, to write my account of this initiative with an eye into policies of international collaboration involving Global North and the Global South. This report I published somewhere. Well, when I was there, Bruno Latour came for a conference about his much talked book, new book at that time in 1989, Science in Action. There was a full house and I thought it would be impossible to talk with him. Then by chance, I met him by himself at the department office after lunch. I introduced myself. He asked what I was doing and I told him about the Maracá Rainforest Project. I told him that to hand out this immense natural laboratory to foreign researchers did not seem right to me and nor fair and certainly not beneficial for the country. His reply was, and here I quote, "There is no such thing as a natural laboratory. Laboratories are socially constructed and need money, skills, instruments, political support. Can Brazil supply them?" Then he mentioned that his brother-in-law, a pedologist, had been living in Manaus, the capital of the state of Amazon, working at the Institute for National Research, the National Institute for Research in Amazonia. His brother-in-law was a researcher over STOM, the French Research for Development Cooperation Agency, and he said, "I'm willing to go there to visit him and perhaps do some research." I was back to the Research Council in 1990 after doing this time in Edinburgh, and I carried with me Latour's remark about the non-existence of a natural laboratory. I totally understand his point. But the expression is a classic in science policy circles in the Global South, meaning a natural environment that is unique to a country and a hotspot for science, and as such, can be used by the South to negotiate with the North access to funding, training of researchers, equipment, in international research collaboration agreements. Because of him, I have collected many policy documents of different countries in the South and research articles showing the use of the term. More recently, a very good paper published in Research Policy about ALMA, the astronomy laboratory in Chile. Well, in 1993, when I had already moved to an academic life at the university, I was teaching the sociology of science to my students, and that was when I became more familiar with Bruno Latour's work. And then I came across with an article he had just published in 1993, The Pédophile of Boa Vista, ou La Référence Scientifique. It was published in Raison Pratique. This article was republished in a book in various compilations translated into different languages, written of high impact. For me, it became an obsession. For almost 30 years, I read and read again and again that beautifully written article. I was marveled by his account of the case study and how the sick force is translated in by a series of mediators to the point of becoming words in a thin report. On the other hand, I saw a number of elements missing in the account. Some of them he himself points out in the paper, how he artificially severed the philosophy from the sociology, how he did not account for the division of labor between French and Brazilians, male and female distribution of roles, how he ignored the colonial aspects of the field. He says explicitly, I apologize in advance to the reader, because I'm going to omit many aspects of this field trip that pertain to the colonial situation, and others that I also thought were important. Why is that research question important? Why is it important at that specific moment to know whether the forest or the savanna is advancing? And I also thought that I had to respond to questions such as, how did the authors become involved? Why was this controversy between botanical and the pedologists? What the evidence was showing? Who is funding each one of the researches? Why the samples must be taken to France and cannot be analyzed in Brazil? Where were the publications of this work? Who were the authors? Well, for so many years, I carried out a somewhat collateral and private research project, attempting to fill in the gaps above. In doing so, I reread an article, and every time each paragraph has made me grab pen and paper to write a note, to go after such and such person, interview that specialist, read that paper, find out such document. As today, I have completed over 40 interviews, including with the 2 Brazilian women who have participated, who were there in that fieldwork. I collected considerable number of documents and supporting research articles. I wrote countless drafts of a pretense manuscript and at least 10 drafts of email to be sent to Latour. I never finished the article, and the email, unfortunately, will now never reach him. Why that? I mean, I had the feeling I could not ever make my version of the account as brilliantly as he had made his. In preparing this note, something unexpectedly crossed my mind. I don't know whether I said it before, but I have never been a Latourian. I never really used his framework in my own research. But I must admit that Latour has been for me a most provocative intellectual experience. In trying to revisit his article, I have certainly become a better researcher. Is it not to reflect, research, and debate the most important influence an academic can get from a colleague? Looking from this point of view, I'm certain that Latour was a very influential thinker in my trajectory, and I thank you for this, Bruno.
I was thinking about an event that took place almost exactly 30 years ago. I was at Bruno's Messenger lectures These were incredibly imaginative pieces that became several excellent articles that took us on a speculative journey from baboons to nuclear power plants. Near the beginning of the first of these lectures, Bruno was making an elementary point about technology as a network of humans and non-humans, and his overhead projectors stopped projecting. Some of you will remember those projectors with the transparencies that went with them, onto which you could photocopy what you wanted your audience to see. Anyway, when the machine stopped working, a small crowd descended upon it to see what was wrong, perhaps to switch, or challenging and dangerous, to replace the light bulb. But it was all a trick. The people trying to help out were a stand-in for parts of the network needed to make the machine function. A Confederate had quietly unplugged the far end of the extension cord that fed electricity to the projector. Bruno had made his point. Bruno would often nudge us to see something as amusingly and tellingly strange, something that we might have taken for granted and would never again. He understood how to provoke, often with humor, certainly a lot with exaggeration, and then other more difficult to place forms of fun. For example, he and Steve Woolgar, very near the beginning of the old book Lab Life, made a cheeky case for an anthropologist in the lab. We know that scientific settings and cultures are not straightforwardly like the settings and cultures in which they're embedded. They are, after all, separated in many ways. Why not study them as we would some other culture? And I'll read one sentence in Spanish here, in Castellano. Mientras que ahora tenemos un conocimiento bastante detallado de los mitos y los rituales de circuncisión de las tribus exóticas, seguimos siendo relativamente ignorantes de los detalles de la actividad equivalente entre las tribus de científicos. To show us that the laboratory, to show us that the anthropologist of the laboratory, in this case Bruno, was genuinely approaching it with an open mind, the first photo included in the book was of ductwork above the lab. We later learned to see that as crucial but overlooked epistemic infrastructure. I understand that Bruno showed that photo in some early talks that he gave of that research, and that astounded and shocked many people. Bruno's humor often punctured pretensions, or perhaps we should see it as leveling, which is in keeping with his theoretical and methodological views. Provoking again, in Science and Action, Latour quotes Galileo. But in the physical sciences, when conclusions are sure and necessary, again, this is Galileo, but in the physical sciences, when conclusions are sure and necessary and have nothing to do with human preference, one must take care not to place oneself in the defense of error, for here 1,000 Demosthenes and 1,000 Aristotles would be left in the lurch by any average man who happened to hit on the truth for himself. Even one chapter into Science and Action, was very, very difficult for, I think, any reader to take Galileo seriously ever after. The cartoons filling the pages of Science and Action, which incidentally were very nicely reproduced on those transparencies I talked about, because that was the form of the small black and white figure, and a nicely transparent otherwise presentation worked well. Those cartoons filled the pages, and we see poor Mr. Nobody and his friends cowed by Dr. Somebody and his thousands of allies. So indeed, Latour reversed Galileo completely. So we have never been modern. One more from the very same paper that Leah talked about, from Bruno's study of ecologists and soil scientists and the movement of the Amazon rainforest and the savanna. With childlike curiosity, he watches while researchers identify the colors of soil samples using sophisticated versions of Munsell charts. he watches them put the official swatches of color on top of the samples to try to figure out exactly which color those are. Again, I'll be in Spanish here. Con menos de un milímetro de distancia separándolos, entonces y solo entonces pueden leerse sinópticamente. Sin los agujeros no puede haber alineación y precisión y lectura y por lo tanto no puede haber transmutación de la tierra local en código universal. Sobre el abismo de la materia y la forma, the chasm of material and form, René, that is the scientist he's wanting, brother-in-law? Yeah, René lanza un puente. Es un pasarela, una línea, un gafio. So 1 millimeter, less than 1 millimeter separates the mental chart and the soil. And so Kant is wrong. We can bring form and matter, says Latour, to less than a millimeter from each other. We're going to miss Bruno's next intellectual turn, depending on how you count, maybe 3.0, maybe 4.0, I'm not sure. We'll miss being challenged by his next critical stance. We will miss his exciting next provocations. We'll miss the next time he finds a possible key to understanding something anew. And we will miss the twinkle in Bruno's eye, his genial smile, and his ability to point to something odd and telling, to make it humorous, and then to laugh with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the effort to speak in different languages, to use support, really, to all of you. Thank you very much. This is a multilingual, trilingual conference. So now the floor is open. We would like to hear comments, thoughts, maybe questions to the panelists about their anecdotes, stories. Please raise your hand. Wow, so much science. Yes.
If you are come to a very low, doing this kind of, it's not difficult for me. And I established we have never been, and I had the impression that I catch that tool. Never. Because when I understood my conducting, shifted to another party. When I understood several years before, I've never been told, but working on the Conseil Constitution. And I understood, no, that tool. So, like marks. Okay. The last one was the ecologist. And I can say that I did the right now. I catch a tool to postpone.
else? So that's what. My experience. Oh, you. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, of course, my name is after. There's something I can't. So I acknowledge, I understand. However, when I was in grad school, seminar, I remember classmates, my participants, shared how to vote, make the work that we were discussing about. As a theory, let's say, artifacts. In a comment that left a long lasting that Latour essay, not usually when they are trained or taught to write stuff, meaning it's not accessible. I share that sentiment. There's some Latourian words I can understand easily at first reading, but there are others that I haven't really understand. So I was wondering if any of the panelists tolerant, possible, physical, us to what is up, how Latour some seem to be. Another reason I just remembered, we were discussing me in this room. That we have a couple of graphic companies. I cannot understand what this particular graph that Latour inserted in the book.
I think that graph is a measure of constructedness. That the axes show the constructedness of things. Is this on? Yeah. All right. Yeah. I've thought about Latour's writing a lot. There's an interesting interview that was done with Latour not that long ago. I can't give you the citation to it right now, but I could look it up afterwards. In which Latour talks about his primary school education and just being told, not asked at all, but told to repeatedly describe something. Look at this vase, describe this vase. And he says that this was a crucial part of his education as a writer, this was primary school. But I think that there are many things going on in Latour's writing that he doesn't talk about. I think that I think he has a wonderful sense most of the time of how to make something sort of central in your mind, how to bring it to life, even if it is a bit of a cartoonish life, even if it is this exaggerated thing, but how to put it central in the text, and then how to just smoothly move along to the next thing that he wants to make central. I think his writing, he has been described as saying that as doing his thinking aloud and then sort of coming back to it afterwards. I don't find his writing particularly impenetrable myself, although I'm sure that I have. Like Pablo, I read at least Science in Action in one sitting, or something close, or as close to one sitting as one could possibly do. And so I don't tend to find it, but it is, there are complicated ideas. There's no question about it. There are complicated thoughts, and especially after his coming out as a philosopher, which took place several times, but anyway.
I did think a little bit about this. I did think a little bit about this while I was writing, and I don't know if this is true, and maybe you can help with this too, but his writing, and I don't know if this is a feature of reading it in English as opposed to French, but I don't think he uses the past tense ever. I think it's literally always in the present active. Everything is happening, everything is action, everything is, this is a test for people to go back and look at the tests. I don't think he ever uses the past tense. And that's an unsettling thing to read because true to his philosophy, nothing is ever settled, right? So if that's to be expressed in the semiotic or practical, pragmatic aspects of it, using this active present is the best way to achieve that. I may be wrong about that, but it's a test.
May I just something about, to answer the question. I really think that I always thought that the way he writes as having to do with this French notion of débrayage. So that comes from the theory of enunciation. It's like his enacting different enunciators from time to time, and very often they're nested. And also the ironic effect of his writing comes out of that. So I really think it's grounded in this French theory of enunciation that as he's changing his hats from time to time, and sometimes he's putting more hats on top of it.
A lot of potential. And we know it's extreme. But here, because I have some. So I just want to bring out something I think will touch on. Well, it's something idea of language. So what I feel then is like talk about sound. So like how say like at that time like developing then system to translate back to what it at the beginning I saw like this want to make sure the picture is right. I found like I just enjoy like and that is interesting when that's better to talk about something about this thing. That's like in Taiwanese cowboy. Cowboy is something close to it, but kind of it's counterclass kind of background. So say like Maker did that time have the art exhibition called Don't Cowboy. It's like a Don't so this common spirit and change idea the vocal conversation, and then some of them come something. But still, the sense of art, like sound, resonance. This is something about some of the charming kind of like even text. I check with the sizing. action, the first chapter, I found like you already mentioned various things, like all texts come from something about. I know it's very some typical get back to like some of the parole may say for something words. Okay. But somehow later on we talk about the textual part. We use so simply, obviously, solely on what you write. But if a chance actually I am so grateful. Even like this. Because I simply want the chance, whether we want to be this group, not necessarily we become the Latour, but we want to go with. With actually he using words. Sure, in the Taiwan, he keep using the Taiwanese word to people say like we're God way, we're God with you, we're from here to there. Place the meaning of. I'm not saying like he's a sort of. It's like okay, we pick up some local words like oh that's that or we say so. So it seems like always try to trade back and forth the languages. So I'm really curious about that kind of. Like let's talk about the sonic part of Latour. Just one my one to sort of thing.
Thank you. Someone want to ask other question or reply? One wow. Oh, those.
So building on a couple of comments that people have just made in the last rounds, I always think of Latour as being on journeys, on trips, and one could see this particularly in his spoken presentations. The text also maybe. I have one profound experience that I can't recall all the details of, but I invited him to one of my graduate seminars in social theory. And the students actually did very well. They read the texts that I assigned. What I can't remember is exactly what those texts were now. And Bruno did a master's class. He refused every interpretation that every student provided. But in the process, I don't know how much the students got out of it, but in the process, I learned a lot about his trajectory. I just want to say that I really miss him a lot. I've had a series of missed encounters with him in the sense that well, let me give one. I have a number of anecdotes of this sort, but I'll just use one, which was the text that a number of you have referred to, mode of existence. So as a preview to this, I'm fascinated by the semiotic background and enunciation and so on, because I was astounded one day that Bruno came up to me and he said, you know, I just read John Dewey, and that's really important. And the importance was Dewey's idea that a public is constituted by a crisis, that there is a calling into action of something that didn't exist before. So there was supposed to be an encounter at a AAA meeting between Bruno Latour and a couple of other French authors. Philippe Descola was the other main one, and it was supposed to be an encounter between American anthropology and French anthropology. The encounter never happened, partly because the technological system was such that most of the audience, and Bruno in particular, couldn't hear what the rest of us were saying. But one echo of that was I wrote a piece about that book that came out of that big effort to engage him in front of a very huge audience. And I feel sad at the moment that we did not have a chance to come back to the argument that I was making there. but he did respond indirectly to me, which was that I found that book not difficult to read, but extremely frustrating, because what it did was take a bunch of language games, which in the Anglo-American tradition, we would identify with certain authors. And of course, he wouldn't cite anybody, but he repeated all of these, and they were all enclosed worlds. They didn't interact in the way that he claimed that they were interacting, or that he claimed that the website that was to go along with the book, which was really what he was interested in, the book was just, you know, it was just by the way and whatnot. So I feel sad that I haven't been able to have a conversation with him about that, but he did say to someone, you know, Fisher just shouldn't take me that seriously, or shouldn't take that seriously.
Well, thank you all. Oh, one more? Is it possible? Short one, because we have to go. This is an invitation for all of you to the prize session, another celebration, many people there. So please, very short comment.
Very short, just remembering Aramis, because in Aramis, he plays a lot with the writing style. He has the theoric text, but at the same time, he has this kind of novel, very playful writing about Aramis. So he was also a very playful writer in some ways. He was doing bricolage all the time. So just wanted to tell this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thanks, the panelists, for this celebration of Latour's work on life. And we continue in 10 minutes at the gym downstairs, the big building next to this. Thank you.